When I started to make paintings, there was never the slightest doubt in my mind that I wanted to make abstract paintings. I thought that was absolutely the farthest out thing that had been posited in modernism, and plus I had no facility at all for drawing things that I saw. My interest in drawing from adolescence onward had been much more of the doodly, smoke pot and noodle around sort of idea about drawing, more than the I'm going to draw that tree kind of drawing. It never was even a question to me that I was working in this tradition of modernist abstraction, but there were disconnects built into what I was doing, which I didn't really recognize until they sort of came up and bit me, having to do with the desire to make things that were extremely evocative of aspects of life. I didn't see a lot of the whole tradition of surrealism within modernism is probably as close to what I'm talking about as one would in terms of a historical category. I thought of myself as kind of beyond that and thinking about things much more in a process and material within that sort of paradigm, but trying to bring these ideas about bright color, emotional content, arbitrary decision making into things that were more formally rigorous. And when this kind of stuff started to, this is from around the time of the painting that's upstairs, from this point forward, the terms of the deal for me didn't really change, but I know that it could appear as though there was a sort of choice involved to begin to make things that were pictures of things. I think it's very different to make pictures of things coming out of abstraction than it is to make abstractions of things coming out of the visible world. But that's a long, complicated subject. In some way, I still think of myself as making abstract painting. And I know that my attempts to explain what I'm doing to myself have much more to do with thinking about how to make things and thinking about their structural properties than they have to do with questions of subject matter or narrative. And any time I've ever had the idea to illustrate something that was vaguely narrative, or basically every time I've ever had the idea to make a painting, it's been a disaster. The only way I can find my paintings is in my paintings. And so a lot of the things that, there's a whole process of knocking down one's own resistance that, my experience of painting or of artwork is that it's more like channeling than it is like thinking. I think a lot about art. I look at a lot of other people's art and I think about it. And I guess my hope is that if I'm thinking about their art, they'll think about my art and everything will be good. I can think about my art pretty well. Like when I see the painting upstairs, I made it 10 years ago. I have a sort of distance on it and I remember what my life was like then and I guess what else was going on in the world to a certain extent. And I can see how that those things might have all affected each other. But at the time, all I felt was I have this enormous canvas in my studio, and I'm going to make something, and I kind of know what continent I'm on right now in terms of what my painting hypothesis is. And I kept this giant canvas around in my studio, for me a giant canvas. It's the biggest painting I've ever made. I kept it in my studio while I was working on other things, and I would go to it when I felt I knew what to do, and then I would leave it when I was at some sort of crossroads or blocked. And eventually out of that came that painting. I knew that it was going to be an image of a ship because at that time I had a sort of rudimentary vocabulary of subjects that I used to jump into paintings, that they were basically recontextualizations of shapes and forms that had existed in my work before they were really subjects. And I think the story or the subject was really almost the equivalent of a formal principle, like really just a way to get to work. And in the last few years, I've been pretty under the control of this image of this male character with the phallus growing out of his head and certain fashion attributes, which I can recognize as, I think there's a kind of homeless vocabulary in my work, which probably is very deeply wired in, that gives this, kind of brings back the same forms, the same ideas about composition, but it evolves through different ideas of the physical part of painting and appears to take on the character of different subjects, when in fact there's some set of structural archetypes that are kind of locked in that I think I'm at the mercy of. I think, as I said before, I think much more about different ways of manifesting this thing, this image, this desire to make a painting. I've been exploring a lot of that in the last few years, of making relatively clean, organized looking paintings, and paintings that are a big mess and whose subject matter in some way reflects their nature as a big mess. When I heard the title of this discussion tonight, is What is Painting, my first reaction was, if you have to ask, you probably shouldn't hear the answer. But then I decided to approach it more constructively, and I thought, to close, I would read. I have created my own definition of painting. Painting is a relatively recent manifestation of humanity's ancient effort to understand and exploit pictorial space, generally understood to consist of sheets of colored paste spread manually across primarily rectilinear planar supports, embodying illusionistic or quasi-narrative properties, although each of the previous characteristics have been challenged and contradicted to great theoretical and expressive effect without the loss of basic categorical integrity. Testimony to painting's nature as both bounded and infinite, and its ability to absorb apparently conflicting attitudes on the part of its creators. Painting operates at the nexus of intersubjective experience and consensual reality, relying on both for its subject matter while remaining stubbornly self-referential, and its content extends into the areas we call psychological, social, material in both the philosophical and economic senses of the word, and, for lack of a better term, spiritual, giving it unusual utility as a tool for studying the evolution of the self, of socio-cultural systems, and of the complex reciprocities between the two, strikingly manifest in the apparent disconnect within painting's dual nature as potentially both a symbolic repository of capital and a facilitator of profound contemplation, a perfect storm of the crass, the sacred, and the intimately personal. So now you know what it is.